Welcome everyone to the Financial Services HR and Compliance webinar. I'm Zoe Foster, I chair the network and I'm also Head of Marketing and Events at our co-sponsor Varan Performance. I hope you're all keeping well and managed to enjoy a little break over the summer. I'm delighted to see so many familiar faces in the attendance today. I wish we could be in person and also to welcome the new and first timers who have heard about us through our LinkedIn group, but also through our sponsors, Osborne Clarke and Varan Performance. So welcome everyone. I want to remind you of the three key objectives of our seminars. The first is to understand the impact that new and changing legislation has on financial services businesses. So hence the regulatory update we do at the very beginning of the session. The second is to provide a space for industry peers to collaborate and share best practice under Chatham House rules. And of course, that's a little bit more difficult because it's on a webinar, so you can't network with each other. However, the LinkedIn group allows you to connect with other members who have joined us today. So please do that and connect up with the members of the group so that you can share some best practice and some challenges together. And third and finally, most importantly, to promote a consistent approach to regulatory and non-regulatory challenges across the financial industry as a whole. We host free breakfast seminars throughout the year, although currently, as I say, they are operating online. We have just over 4,000 HR and compliance members across all levels that represent more than 1,200 regulated businesses across the country. So we're really proud of the network. We are one of a kind, and we are very thankfully sponsored by two brilliant companies. The first is Varan Performance, a boutique HR and finance technology and transformation consultancy who help businesses select, improve or deploy all HR and payroll and finance technology. We also have Osborne Clarke. Speakers are on our panel today as well. Osborne Clarke are lawyers who live and breathe their sectors, and I can truly say that from the heart, and businesses. They give advice that is commercially on point and relevant and help tackle the challenges you're facing today and prepare you for the ones that you'll face tomorrow. I love that tagline, that is the best. So if you have any questions about the network or indeed our sponsors, please contact me after the session and I'll happily put you in touch today. So moving on to the agenda for this morning, I will shortly be handing over to James Turner, Associate Director in the Financial Institutions Group at Osborne Clarke. James will be sharing the latest financial regulation, focusing on the most recent consultation paper on diversity and inclusion, as well as a quick recap on the FCA's 21-22 business plan. James will then hand straight over to Tom Holmes, the founding director of Varan Performance, Olivia Simfeld, partner at Osborne Clarke, and Izzy Turner, associate at Osborne Clarke. They will be peeling back the uncertainty around vaccinations and where employers stand, and will be answering your questions. We have actually already received lots of questions in from the audience today prior to the session, which we're going to try and answer as best as we can today. And of course, please, I encourage you to use the Q&A button on Zoom, which is at the bottom panel, as they will be monitored as we go through. So we will try and answer as many of them as possible. The session should take us to around 10 o'clock. So without further ado, I will hand over to you, James.
Thanks very much, Zoe. Great. Well, thanks for that intro. And in which case, I won't need to set out what I'm going to talk about, so I'll get straight on with it. Starting with the FCA Business Plan. And sometimes the FCA Business Plan can be actually quite bland and boring. Whereas this year, actually, I think it's the tone of the business plan, as well as some of the specific content, signals a really interesting shift in direction and shift in emphasis by the FCA. In terms of the priorities that they're talking about focusing on, actually much of it is either more of the same in the case of their priorities in retail markets, or relatively benign extensions and evolutions of what they've worked on before. So for example, they pick out 6 what they describe as cross-market issues, which respectively are fraud, financial resilience, operational resilience, diversity and inclusion, sustainability, and international cooperation. We'll talk in more detail about diversity and inclusion in a couple of minutes, but to be honest, that is probably the only truly new area of those 6. None of the other 5 are any particular surprise. So actually, the most interesting thing to take from the business plan is what it says about how the FCA is going to develop and, in their own words, improve their own effectiveness as a regulator. And this very much has Nikhil Rathi, the relatively new CEO's stamp all over it. He clearly has been brought in with a mandate to move the FCA forward as a regulator, and that is all over this business plan. And the reason that's so important is when you read the business plan, there is a palpable sense that the FCA is going to operate differently from how it has done historically. And there are 3 specific ways that the business plan talks on that subject. The first is a big focus on the use of data and technology. Now, I know from conversations with other clients that even by recent standards, the amount of information requests coming from the FCA to firms across market segments there's been another step change. And this is reflective both of the FCA's general priorities, but also the FCA is undergoing its own transformation on its own terms into a very data and technology-led regulator. And you can actually see that in some of the senior hires at FCA Exco level. They now have at least 2 people who are focused heavily on how does the FCA obtain, analyze, and use data at the highest and most sophisticated levels. So that is a thread that runs throughout this, that the FCA is going to be really focused on obtaining, breaking down, analysing, and then acting on data in a way that historically it has been. I mean, obviously, it's always, they would always say that they've operated on the basis of the data they receive, but this is a new level, almost a very 21st century, if you might say, way of approaching data and analytics. The second, and I think this is of great interest to our colleagues in regulatory disputes, the FCA talks about being more assertive. Now, people who've necessarily been involved in FCA enforcement actions may struggle to imagine how the FCA could be more assertive, but in fairness, although they don't name this as an incident, I do think reading between the lines that the FCA have been a bit stung by things like the collapse of Greensill Capital and also the rise of buy now, pay later finance, which they now refer to as deferred payment credit. And in terms of the FCA has come under political pressure over things like Greensill as to why didn't they do something about it. Now, of course, the answer to why didn't they do something about it was that Greensill's supply chain finance product wasn't actually regulated by the FCA. And I think what they've taken from this, and what they actually say in the business plan, is they intend to be effectively test the boundaries of their powers a bit more. I would say, and I did spend some time in the FCA about 8 years ago, that historically the FCA have been very sensitive to any accusations that they've gone beyond their statutory powers. And what this business plan is hinting at, and we'll have to see how this plays out, effectively, if there's a question over whether the FCA has jurisdiction, they will assume that they do until they get told by a court that they don't. And I think that could potentially have a lot of very interesting consequences for enforcement edge cases. And then in addition, they talk about adaptation. And it's a bit difficult to work out exactly what they mean by this, but the example they call upon is specifically where they don't have their own powers to act, they're quite explicit that they're going to prod other regulators, and they talk about the Information Commissioner's Office, they talk about foreign regulators as well in the case of overseas firms. So I think we'll have to see what impact, if any, that has, and I suspect that probably won't crystallise for a couple of years. But I recommend the business plan to particularly to compliance professionals. It's a very digestible document and worth a read. Moving on then to the joint consultation between the FCA, PRA and the Bank of England that was published, I think, in July, since our last meeting. There's a lot in there that's very interesting. And specifically, I won't go through all the proposals because actually they're quite vague and incoherent. But there are a couple of really interesting gems to pull out of that. People may recall that the press focused on two very, very granular aspects. The first of the FCA's suggestion that they wanted to remove what they describe as uninclusive language from their own rules. The example that all the press led on, which was far and away from the most important proposal on here, but journalists loved this stuff, was the proposal to do away with the term Chinese wall on the basis that that type of language is no longer acceptable. But in addition to that, the other piece that the press tended to pick up on was the suggestion that the remuneration of senior managers should be linked to D&I targets. And I think actually I've previously worked in-house at a very large bank and also as the only lawyer at a fintech. And I don't think that will become as a huge shock for many large institutions, but there is a real opportunity to shape what the regulators are going to do in this area. The consultation is open until the end of this month. As I say, the proposals at this stage are really, really at an early stage, and I think all the regulators are genuinely interested in hearing what firms have to say in terms of what, if any, rules they may seek to put in place to improve diversity and inclusion within regulated firms. And I just close with a couple of observations about this. The first is it's in what the FCA and particularly the PRA are seeking to achieve is they see D&I as their business because it is critical to two elements. The first being the culture of the regulated firms generally, which as we know is a huge priority for the regulators. But secondly, and this is a slightly less well described connection, they also see D&I, particularly of customer-facing or product governance colleagues, as critical to product design, particularly when it comes to customers who have protected characteristics or may be vulnerable. So I'll just close by saying that it's really, again, it's a consultation paper that's really worth a read. I think unlike some consultation papers, and I can be a bit cynical, particularly about the FCA in this piece, I don't think they've made up their mind. I think they are genuinely interested in hearing feedback, ideas, suggestions. And I say that because I think actually lots of firms already do lots of really good thinking and really good work on D&I. And on this, the FCA would accept themselves that they don't know the answers. Just looking at their own organization, they've got some way to go and they acknowledge that. So I would actually say you've got a real opportunity to, particularly as people, to shape the rules that it's pretty clear there's going to be some kind of package of rules. And on that note, I can see it's 9:15, so I'm going to hand over to Tom, Olivia and Izzy to talk about vaccination and the pitfalls associated therewith.
Thanks, James. Good morning, everyone. I'm Tom Holmes, Founding Director of Varan Performance. We focus on digital transformation of the back office for financial services, which we will, in light of the FCA's drive that James has told us about this morning, will make a key focus of future sessions. And I'm joined this morning by Olivia Sinfield, who is partner at Osborne Clarke, and Izzy Turner, associate Osborne Clarke. Welcome, you two, to address the questions which you guys have already submitted, of which I've got a big list. So I'm going to fire off all the questions which we've already received from you guys on the topic of vaccinations, etc. Please enter any other questions, and I will blindsight Izzy and Olivia with those as we go through. So keep putting your questions in as we go. So Olivia, firstly, before we delve into the detail, can you tell us a little bit about the approach being taken to vaccination mandates in the market?
Yeah, of course. Thanks very much, Tom, and Zoe too. It's great to be back, by the way, post summer holidays. There were probably, no doubt, a few of us from this group visiting Durdle Door at the same time in August, which apparently I was reading was the most visited landmark this summer. Jabs and jobs. Well, this issue has been debated for a fair while now, but it's currently very much under the spotlight again since the self-isolation requirements changed in August. Just as a reminder, of course, that people don't have to self-isolate if they're pinged and have been double jabbed over 2 weeks previously. It's also a hot issue since we're hearing a lot of news from what's happening in the US, and then bringing us bang up to date since the government's announcement yesterday in respect to their winter plan, and we'll come back to that later. Just before I start, I should flag that as a lawyer, we love a good caveat. Everything we say today is just in respect of England only. So the position does vary slightly in Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland, where devolved governments have issued their own guidance. So just need to watch out for that. And also, this is a really, really fluid situation. So everything we're talking about today, on the 15th of September, is true as of today. It may change tomorrow. So you have to keep on top of the guidance and just be wary of that if you're listening to this on a recording. So Tom, back to your question, I am getting to it, is where are we in respect of mandates? So as far as the government are concerned, government approved mandates are really limited, and at the moment they simply don't extend to workplaces generally. They extend only so far as to care homes with that mandate coming in November. They did originally say that from the end of September, they were going to mandate full vaccinations for entry into nightclubs or venues that welcome large crowds. But you've probably recently seen there's been something of a U-turn here. And this was reflected in the COVID winter plan that was announced yesterday, where they're saying as part of Plan B, so the next stage that we will be moving to at some point during the autumn or winter, then mandatory vaccine passports may be used again for mass events. Where we're at the moment is we're in stage A, which involves encouraging the use of vaccinations rather than mandating them. Interestingly, the plan does actually encourage businesses to consider using the COVID NHS pass. So that's when you ask people to show evidence of vaccinations, testing or natural immunity. But again, it references it being used as more as a condition of entry for things into like festivals, football matches, rather than as a matter of course in office environments. So we'll talk about that this morning too. There's no change since yesterday in relation to the latest guidance on working safely, for example, in office environments, which quite simply doesn't provide employers with any advice or guidance around mandating vaccinations, which it's unsatisfactory. We're hoping for some clarification coming through soon. So in terms of what we're seeing in the market, it's a mixed bag. A lot of our clients are debating it at the moment, particularly those that are experiencing pressure from US group companies where mandates there are much more common practice. You've probably seen this week that Biden announced new mandates for any employers with more than 100 employees, requiring those people to be either vaccinated or tested weekly. And that covers we think about 2/3 of the American population. Just one nuance there that has been missed in some press articles, it's not just a vaccination mandate, there is the alternative of testing weekly, which again is a point we'll come to. But the approach we're still seeing here is the encouraging, not the mandating of vaccinations in broad terms. So, for example, there's the likes of NatWest who, as part of that encouragement piece, are providing paid leave for staff to get vaccinated. We've heard from the likes of HSBC who have said they're not going to issue a mandate before people return to work, but they will require proof of vaccination status or lateral flow testing for any large events they hold. But anyone mandating vaccinations at the moment is still very much an outlier. And there are other different approaches being considered, which we'll talk around this morning. But where we stand as today, the most common approach for employers who are looking to put in place an additional measure is still requiring testing before people are coming into work, and then acting on trust rather than asking to see the evidence of negative test results. And we'll delve into the detail as we go through.
Thanks, Olivia. So Izzy, do our staff still have to tell us if they've been identified as close contacts of anyone who's been tested positive, and do they have to self-isolate or not? I've lost the plot on this area. So what's the...
So if they're required to self-isolate, then yes, they need to tell you that, and they need to follow the guidance to self-isolate. But in terms of being a close contact doesn't necessarily equate to having to self-isolate anymore because of the exemptions that Olivia mentioned. So now if you're double vaccinated, or you are medically exempt, or you're under 18 and a half years old, you're not required to self-isolate if you're identified as a close contact of someone with COVID-19, unless you go on to develop symptoms or test positive. So for employers, it means that self-isolating staff will let you know. Close contacts don't have to let you know, but realistically, if they are a close contact, then they kind of present a higher risk of COVID-19, and government guidance suggests they get PCR tests and take measures such as avoiding close contact with people and wearing face masks. So in practice, employers might actually still want to know if you've tested positive, in case they want to put in some extra kind of health and safety precautions, such as requiring staff to stay at home until they've done that PCR test. So if you're thinking about that, you probably want to put out a policy kind of telling staff that they need to let you know, and also kind of providing information about who falls in those categories, so staff know whether they need to stay at home or let you know or come in.
And on a side question, Isabel, do we need to record this if this happens?
So in terms of the onus, at the moment, it's very much on individuals to kind of attest to whether they have to self-isolate, rather than the onus on employers to go out and check this with staff. There's no legal requirement for employers to check this. However, having said that, you will have a duty of care towards your staff to look after their health and safety. And there is an offence if you knowingly allow people to come into the office when they're required to self-isolate. So you will want to tread carefully and kind of do a bit of kind of profile raising and information kind of raising, so that staff know they need to let you know and stay at home if they're required to self-isolate.
Interesting. That's an interesting record keeping question. Do we need to check at all that our staff are exempt from that duty to self-isolate, therefore?
No, it's the same kind of point as before, in the sense that there is no legal duty on employers to go out and check this. It's very much staff having to let you know. But you know, if you hear on the grapevine or people tell you in passing that they've kind of been pinged or that they need to self-isolate, then you will want to make sure that they're kind of following the correct guidance and you're not letting them into the office if they're required to self-isolate.
So if you're exempt from that, and you're exempt and you've been notified of being a close contact, can we insist on those staff coming into work? So someone who has a close contact but are exempt from that self-isolation rule, which sounds like the position, can we insist on those guys coming into work?
Yes, however, kind of caveat. So ultimately, they're exempt from the requirement to self-isolate, which means that they can come in. However, having said that, they are likely to present a higher risk. So it's just making sure you're ticking off those kind of health and safety angles to make sure that you've got any kind of extra precautions in place if you're bringing staff in. So you might want to make sure that you are you've got screens in place and that the workplace is COVID secure. And also, on the flip side, staff may have reasons why they don't feel safe coming in if they are identified as a close contact, if for instance they have kind of health conditions which place them at higher risk, in which case it might be a reasonable adjustment to let them remain at home for the kind of self-isolation period.
But we can insist on them coming if we wish to, if there was a good reason.
Yes, if you're kind of doing it safely and reasonably, then yes.
Okay. So, so also further to that, can we insist on fully vaccinated staff coming back to the office where they have not been given a self-isolation ping?
So yes, I guess the starting point is that most employees will be on office-based contracts, and it's only by exception that they've been working from home until recently because of government mandate, and since kind of July, because employers have been kind of gradually bringing staff back in. So, you know, contractually, yes, you can require staff to come back into the office, but you can't really ignore the fact that for the last 18 months they've been at home. So you'll want to kind of give them a lead in time, make sure that staff understand that the office is COVID secure, kind of be upfront and transparent with staff about what COVID secure measures you have in place, and basically keep an open mind to individuals who have kind of individual reasons why it might not be appropriate for them to return right now.
Right. So, Olivia, related to that, can we therefore mandate vaccinations?
$1 million question, Tom, there, I think. So yeah, the key issue here from an employment perspective that we have to think about is whether this is a reasonably practicable step to take, and whether it's a necessary one. And we have to look at that in the context of your obligations as an employer under the Health and Safety Act to keep people safe in the workplace. So it all comes down to the justification. The answer is always going to be fact specific, and it will differ for office-based environments as compared to where people are continuing to work largely from home, as compared to working environments where people have to have close contact with others, particularly if those others are in a vulnerable category. But the general rule of thumb at the moment is for office environments or where employees are continuing to work from home that no, we should not be issuing blanket vaccination mandates. And I'll just take you through, put a bit of colour on that, take you through the key reasons why. So the most obvious reason is we have the government, the ICO, ACAS, the Human Rights Commission, who are all saying that. And it's clear from the direction of travel yesterday around vaccination passports that that is the messaging, that they're stressing this is a personal choice. It's not a legal requirement. So employers mandating vaccinations would undermine and be completely contrary to that messaging. Second key reason, and I mentioned there, we have to be able to justify why we're introducing any sort of policy like that, is it is very difficult to justify that on a health and safety basis. And that's because vaccinations are not at the moment included as a COVID secure health and safety measure that businesses are required to put in place for getting people back into offices in the latest guidance. So instead, the focus is on things like making sure you've got really good ventilation, upping what's happening on the cleaning front, considering ongoing social distancing, wearing of masks in communal areas. The guidance as well also makes it really clear that vaccinations are not a substitute for any of those health and safety measures. So we can't justify it on the basis of, well, if we have a vaccination mandate in place, that means we can get rid of social distancing, for example. That won't work. It's not an either or. You then throw in on top of all of that, you've got human rights issues, and there's been a lot about this in the press recently around freedom of choice and privacy. On the data protection piece, and we'll come on to that later, there's an issue around, well, what is our lawful basis for processing that data? And we're going to simply end up with a whole load of data that we potentially won't be using. Then on the employment side, it could give rise to discrimination issues where certain employees have protected characteristics, such as a disability, another health condition, which means they can't get vaccinated. So all of that sort of are the reasons why we would recommend against it from a legal perspective. You've also then got to factor in from a cultural perspective where this sits. And does that sit with your firm's cultural alignment? And I think for most at the moment, the answer is no, it doesn't. We know this is becoming more commonplace in the US, but at the moment, it just doesn't translate culturally well in the UK, particularly at the moment where so much of the current focus is on unifying workforces, engagement, and bringing people together. Also have to consider that there is a real publicity angle here. So businesses that are mandating vaccinations, we are seeing hitting the front pages of the press, because essentially having that sort of policy that is seen as a curtailment on individuals' freedoms and goes further than the government guidance is always going to attract negative comment. So it remains a watch this space. I think the last point to mention is, since yesterday's announcement, there is a question mark around all of this going forwards. We've got a real habit over here of following in the US footsteps. So the government may adopt a different stance going forwards, particularly if, or I think it's probably more a case of when we go into Plan B territory. The position may also change as the medical evidence around the effectiveness of vaccinations changes and develops over time. And it might also change as well once the rules around social distancing change and once that's removed from office environments, whereas at the moment the current position is officers should be considering retaining that. So at the moment it's a no, but it's a watch this space.
Are there exceptional circumstances where you can mandate vaccinations?
There's always the odd exception to any rule, Tom, otherwise we'd be out of a job. So yeah, there are, but they're fairly fact specific. So to throw out a couple of examples, if you have, for example, employees whose job involves travelling overseas and vaccinations are necessary for entry into that country, then vaccination could be a necessary job requirement and a mandate is more likely to be justifiable. But even then, that's only going to justify a mandate on a case-by-case basis rather than that sort of blanket approach, which I know some firms are considering. Right. The second scenario where we've been talking to clients about imposing mandates is where close contact is absolutely essential in the workplace and just can't be avoided, and where they've got to the point that their health and safety risk assessment has determined that this is needed as an additional health and safety measure to kind of underpin all of those other health and safety measures they've got in place. But even then, the approach most have been taken isn't just mandating vaccinations, but is instead saying, we're requesting sight of either your vaccination status or proof of natural immunity or evidence of testing via disclosure or sight of the NHS app.
So if we can't mandate the vaccinations to make our workplaces safe, can we ask employees to tell us and give us evidence of their vaccination status? Can we ask them to show us the evidence so that we can then act upon that if people are not vaccinated?
Yeah, so this is all around, can we get employees to self-attest, essentially, isn't it, to what their COVID status is? Sorry, I lost you all for a little bit there. So where we stand, the guidance is pretty clear that we should only be collecting vaccination status in really, really limited circumstances. But it hasn't ruled it out altogether. So where the position here is slightly different from, say, in Ireland, where the data protection regulator have said there's absolutely no legal basis for collecting vaccination data at all. Here, it comes back to that point I mentioned earlier about we have to show it's necessary and relevant to a specific purpose. So what you can't do is collect that, get employees to self-attest and store that self-attestation data just in case because it's a nice to have. The rules make it pretty clear that from the start, you really have to pin down what your justification is, what you're trying to achieve in terms of getting employees to self-attest and storing that data, and then thought through whether there's any alternative approaches you could be taking as well. The kind of key additional layer to throw into the mix here is on the data protection side. Because this is health data and special category data, we have to identify an additional lawful basis for processing the data. So essentially that boils down to we have to be able to demonstrate that processing of that data, so keeping those self-attestation forms, is necessary for health and safety purposes. So That won't cover all scenarios. So for example, if you were wanting to get employees to self-attest purely for monitoring purposes, that's a no. And the ICO have been very clear on that. That will not be justifiable. If you're going to get employees to self-attest, but actually most people are still working from home, again, there won't be any health and safety angle, so that won't be justifiable. Slightly different scenarios. So for example, if you're looking at asking employees to self-attest to make sure you're doing the right thing around self-isolation, so going back to the point Izzy mentioned before, that can be justified on health and safety grounds, because the self-isolation regs say that an employer must not knowingly allow somebody to come into work unless they've checked what their status is. So in that context, checking COVID status can be positioned as a necessary step to check that only exempt persons are attending the office. So it is fairly fact specific. There's also an issue around, I've heard some businesses say they're wanting to collect the data as a sort of comfort blanket, so a confidence boosting measure because of customer or staff preference. Yeah. And I think from that perspective, that is going to be harder to justify on those health and safety grounds. So if that's the reason, we do really need to be looking at and bringing in our health and safety advisors into the conversation here. What is the health and safety reason why we need to be collecting this sort of data, if indeed we're going to collect it? Because the other possibility is we write to employees, rather than saying you need to self-attest and fill out a form, say online, and send that back into us, by virtue of which we're holding the data, you say to employees, to return to, when you're returning to the office, you should be vaccinated and or being undertaking, for example, 2 tests per week. And we put the control into their hands, and we go forwards on from a position of trust, which I know is the approach some businesses are taking. And then you avoid all of those data protection issues completely.
Right, but overall, if you want to try and get people vaccinated for the safety of colleagues, or indeed for customers, etc., it's the health and safety route which is the way to go.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So what do we do if our employees refuse to be vaccinated? If we want to mandate, if our view is that they should be, and disclose that vaccination status. So if they either refuse or they won't disclose their vaccination status, what can we do?
Yeah, and this is where, you know, this question is really, are we in disciplinary or dismissal territory? And we do have to tread really carefully here. And essentially, we need to get to the heart first of why they're objecting, so that we shouldn't be taking any action without talking to them first, because if that issue or that objection is linked to a protected characteristic such as a religious belief or a disability, then we could be in discrimination territory if we do look to discipline or dismiss, and that applies to equally to employees and contractors as well. If there isn't the discrimination risk, then when we're looking at employees with under 2 years service, we do have a reduced risk profile because they're not able to bring constructive unfair dismissal claims, but we've still got that human rights angle that I mentioned at the start. And then for people with over 2 years service, where we are in potential unfair dismissal or constructive unfair dismissal territory, we're back to the courts looking at whether is that instruction a reasonable one in all the circumstances? So all paths always travel back to that key question of what is your justification? Is that mandate a necessary, reasonably practicable step to take? If it isn't, and particularly if we can't find that health and safety justification, we're going to be in trouble.
So what do we do when other staff members and colleagues don't want to work or refuse to work with people who either are not vaccinated or won't say whether they're vaccinated or not?
Yeah, and we're finding this is a big problem at the moment. So most of the issues we're seeing are arising from the vaccinated sort of quarters rather than from the unvaccinated, which is slightly different to how we thought it was going to play out. You know, it's a really sensitive situation. There's no getting away from that. And it will involve consulting with them to understand their reason for and basis for their concern, and trying to alleviate that in the first instance by explaining what other COVID secure measures that you have in place and demonstrating that you are complying in full with that guidance. We did have one situation where the business handled it by actually showing the employee their risk assessment so that they understood what measures had to be in place and what they'd done to meet that pretty high bar, and also making sure that that employee's line manager understood the individual's concerns and was looking to put in extra measures like enforcing social distancing when the team were getting together, particularly where you may have a team where everybody else is comfortable with sitting next to each other. The one other point as well to flag here is if the reason why somebody is unhappy about this links to the fact they've got a disability, so are in a more vulnerable category, then actually it may well be a reasonable adjustment to consider them moving them from having to work with somebody who hasn't been vaccinated. So then we'd be into looking at, well, maybe can that person continue to work from home? Could they work elsewhere? So again, as ever with all of this, it's fairly fact specific.
Yes, but I can see that getting quite emotive, because if someone is, presumably the main reason is that they are scared of getting COVID. And if the employer is saying, well, we don't know whether anyone's vaccinated, we haven't mandated any form of vaccination, but we've got the windows open and they're trying to enforce social distance in the office, that isn't going to cut the mustard with many of those people who have genuine concerns, I guess. So it is an emotive topic, I am thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. But I guess one thing to make clear is ultimately, after you've gone through that process and explored all options and all alternatives, is that if somebody point blank refuses to work because there are people in the office who aren't vaccinated, and we've got to the point of being satisfied, actually, we've done our best to try and address their concerns, there may be no option but to consider a disciplinary action. So it's not really the type of scenario we want to be in, but I think in some cases it will be inevitable.
So on the other side of the scale, what do we do about people who are vocal anti-vaxxers in our work environments and in our companies? So some person is kind of vocally anti-vax, or maybe even not obeying things like social distancing and stuff like that in the office.
Yeah, and actually, before I answer the question, I have to be very careful on this, because I stood corrected the other day when we were talking with a client about anti-vaxxers, because most people who are vocal around with concerns about the vaccination don't see themselves as anti-vaxxers. They see themselves as people who are concerned about the COVID vaccine and the way it's been rolled out, and particularly issues around consent. So in terms of that terminology, we're having to be very careful about how we use that at the moment. But
right, so these people are also vaccine cautious, they're vaccine negative, they're not positive about the vaccine, as well as being they're kind of anti-vaxxers in from the media, etc. So it's a much broader church of views. Okay, but these people who may be vocal about that point of view, what can we do about that, Olivia? Or do we need to do anything?
I think yes, we do, and sort of in terms of the sort on the legal side of it first, before we move on to the practical side. The first consideration is whether do people who hold an anti-COVID vaccination belief, could that be seen as being a philosophical belief for discrimination purposes? Because if it is, then, of course, we would have to be uber cautious and careful about how we deal with that situation. So just to kind of put a bit of colour on that, to qualify as a philosophical belief, it has to be part of what's described as a cohesive and serious conviction, rather than being somebody's view just about the COVID vaccination. So if you have somebody in the workplace who is opposed to vaccinations generally, and say has never had a vaccination in their life, not just COVID, then potentially we could be in philosophical belief territory, as opposed to people where the issue is around the COVID vaccination alone. We're probably not. At least that's what we think at the moment, but of course it's untested for now. So with that in mind, where people are being particularly vocal about their own views, and those are operating to the discomfort of others, I think in the first instance, we need to be addressing that directly with them, and explaining how that makes the other people feel, and ultimately giving them a clear instruction that they should not be doing that in the workplace, and making it clear if they continue to do so, then further action may have to be taken. And if it continues, we may have to escalate it to disciplinary action. One other practical point to sort of throw out here as well, some of our clients, in terms of their comms they're sending out to employees now around vaccinations, are kind of raising this, so dealing with it up front and asking employees not to ask each other about vaccination status, explaining that they consider it to be a personal choice, and this is kind of part of the organisation's culture of respect and tolerance, and that seems to be working quite well as well. So that might be something which listeners might want to consider doing.
Interesting. Okay, so finally, on a more practical terms, are employees entitled to paid time off to get vaccinated?
It's a quick one, this one, Tom. So no.
Okay.
I'll give you a little bit more. It's a no. There isn't a legal. There's not a legal right to it, but we're finding most of our clients are allowing people to take paid time off. But first of all, asking them that they try and arrange it during their own time, if they can first.
Okay, Izzy, what do we need to consider from a health and safety perspective?
Yeah, so employees have health and safety obligations to staff and visitors. So making sure that if you're having staff back in the office or visitors, that you're kind of COVID secure, and how you're kind of go about this is with a COVID-19 risk assessment, and that will be very much informed by the kind of latest government guidance. So at the moment for offices, the government recommends kind of hand washing stations and kind of minimizing contact that might be by having staff back to back, or barriers, or social distancing, or masks. So making sure that you're kind of covering that off in a live risk assessment document that you update as you kind of develop your policy or government guidance changes. And it's really to kind of show and tell your workings if, for instance, you are introducing things like mandatory vaccinations or kind of requiring attestations. And also to feed into this, if you're making significant changes affecting health and safety at work, this could trigger the obligation to consult with staff under the health and safety consultation regulations. So that means kind of going out to staff or unions if they're unionised to kind of update staff on your proposals, to get their feedback and to kind of work with them as you kind of roll out the changes. And not only will that help to kind of tick off your health and safety obligations, but also it will help demonstrate that you're acting reasonably from the employment side as well.
Great. And presumably, or rather you can answer this yourself, how does this vary outside England? Because most of our companies are international. So what's the story? How do we coordinate that stuff?
It is a tricky one. As Olivia's kind of alluded to, different countries are taking different approaches. In America, for instance, it's much more common and accepted to mandate vaccination. And that's kind of endorsed at a political level as well. Other countries such as France and Italy have kind of taken a more interventionist approach and requiring kind of COVID passes for certain kind of venues and events. But the UK is very much on a kind of encouragement level rather than kind of requiring staff to demonstrate vaccination status, and that's been kind of endorsed in yesterday's autumn winter plan, which kind of rolled back from mandating vaccination status. So it is a difficult one for employers with an international presence who might want to kind of make sure there's a consistent approach across jurisdictions, and we found some UK companies with kind of head offices in the US coming under quite a bit of pressure to try and kind of marry the two together, but unfortunately it's not really a one size fits all kind of offering at the moment, and you probably will have to tailor it to kind of UK culture, which is less interventionist at the moment.
I see. So England once again is going it alone and doing its own path for now. Great. Do we need vaccination policies in our companies? Do we actually need a written policy, Isabel?
So there's no legal requirement to have a vaccination policy, but if you are kind of rolling out changes that kind of diverge from kind of the government guidance. So if you are kind of mandating vaccines or you're requiring attestation of lateral flows, etc., then you will need to put that in a policy so employers understand the rationale behind it and what you're doing. Even companies who aren't kind of taking those steps are sometimes finding it's useful to have a policy to kind of do that information and profile raising point that we mentioned, or kind of to direct employees to useful guidance, and kind of using it as a bit of a source of information as to, you know, if they're coming into the office, what COVID secure measures to expect, or where to find, you know, desk booking if that's something you're putting in place, or links to kind of government guidance on self-isolation, so that kind of staff are aware of their obligations and the company's expectations.
Thank you very much, both. That was an awful lot of questions, and that was really useful and interesting. I guess my reflection is, if I went back 2 years and heard what we're talking about now, with the lack of clarity, lack of guidelines, lack of ability to mandate certain safety precautions, etc., we wouldn't believe it, would we? I mean, this is changing daily and is incredibly unclear on these areas, and requires quite a lot of thought and consultation on each area.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, both of you, for your input. I see there are no questions out there. So there's one.
There are a couple of questions.
Right. So now we're starting to see, particularly in Israel, it's seemingly more likely that double vaccinated people can A, fall ill with COVID, and B, spread it. Therefore, are we at risk of failing to protect all staff by forcing them to come into the office in this fast-moving, ever-changing landscape? Or is it an adequate defence to rely on government guidance at the moment? So actually, that's a good point. Government guidance, you've talked about it being fairly non-mandatory, non-pushy and all that stuff. Does that actually protect us?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. And just before we answer that, just one other sort of point that hasn't come out yet. You mentioned, Tom, there, a lack of clarity from the government, which I agree with. But one thing they have published is a COVID-19 vaccination guide for employers. But the focus of that is around what you can do. Oh, don't get too excited. What you can do to support the vaccination programme, rather than addressing any of these questions around what you can or can't do as a business. But there are some useful resources in that. So things like there's a link to an employer's, they call it a communication toolkit. So there are some vaccination briefing sheets and also scripts in there that you can use as a template for sending out information to employees and to help those internal conversations. So it's worth having a look at that. But to go to Damien's question, which I think is a really good one. At the moment, all you can do at the present time is act in accordance with the government guidance. That is all we have to go on. I think in relation to the point around it looking more likely that double vaccinated people can fall in and spread it, it's interesting, if you look at the autumn-winter plan yesterday, there's a lot of commentary in there around actually almost the opposite point, that how effective the vaccination is being at preventing transmission and seriousness of the people's reaction to it, which probably is slightly unsurprising. So I think this is one where, if you are making decisions though on a health and safety basis, what you need to be able to do is show your justification. So actually refer to specific references in the guidance. If you're going back to relying on health and safety grounds for asking people to disclose vaccination status, testing status, involve your health and safety advisor, so we can actually show that you have looked into that side of things, rather than just making decisions without any factual evidence underpinning them.
Right. So although we might not need a vaccination policy, we do need to make sure we've examined our health and safety rules and assess the risk in that sense. And then that forms some protection in a circumstance such as Damien's setting out, where somebody, you know, feels that they've been put in danger or have been put in danger by another staff member. Great.
There have been two further questions. Sorry,
yes.
Tom, to interrupt. There have been Q&A. I'm not sure you can see that on your post, so I'm just going to read them out. So an anonymous attendee says, my employer has sent around a survey covering our thoughts on the vaccination and also asks whether you have been vaccinated. Is this allowed?
Ooh.
Interesting.
Olivia, is it allowed?
So that goes back to the point, they should be explaining why they're collecting that data. So it goes back to, is it necessary? What is their sort of, have they got a reasonable justification for why they're collecting the data? So from an employee's perspective, I would go back to them and ask that question. Why are you asking me this question? What are you actually using the answer, the data for? But yeah, all the factors we've already talked about are relevant there.
And also, I wonder with that one whether it's kind of collected anonymously or whether they're kind of putting their name to it as well. Yeah,
that's a good point.
Some kind of employers are doing kind of temperature checks at the moment about kind of people's feeling about coming back and how cautious they are. And I suppose if you're collecting it anonymously, some of those data protection requirements fall away.
Then we got a further question, which is if the firm has asked people to return 2 or 3 days a week, and a consultant states they have an underlying health condition and do not feel comfortable coming into the office, are we able to ask them for more details on what that condition is, or insist that they operate within the firm policy and return?
Yeah, so you can definitely ask them for more information around what that condition is. And actually you're going to have to, because otherwise you could get a lot of people who are all sort of adopting the same stance. And then you may have a clause in your contracts that actually says that you can ask people to go and see a doctor and get a medical report as well. It would come down to a conversation with them to try and understand the reasoning. If they've got a disability or a serious health condition, it could be a reasonable adjustment to allow them to continue working from home. If not, then before we get to the point of insisting they come in, we would have to do what we can to kind of provide them with comfort and reassurance around the other COVID secure measures that we've put in place.
Okay, thank you for that, Olivia. That's an answer, but I can see that being a tricky area ongoing. So thank you everybody for your input and your questions, and I'm going to hand back to Zoe to close the session.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, James, as well, for the regulatory update at the beginning. It's always really useful. And just a reminder to everyone that the FCA's annual public meeting is next Tuesday, if you're interested. It's on Zoom. I've been every year for the last few years, and I always find it quite a conversation to attend, so I would recommend that. And also, as James mentioned, do read the consultation papers on D&I. We'll probably be covering it in our January session, and our next session this year will take place at the end of November, and we'll be sending out dates. We will probably be discussing the digitalization of the back office and how that affects financial services companies. And we'll, of course, have our usual regulatory update with James and the OC team. So thank you very much for everyone for attending this morning. The recording will be available within the next 24 hours. And I'll be sharing the contact details of all the panelists today, but do add them on LinkedIn as well to share your questions at a later date. So thank you and have a great rest of the week.
Thank you.